witty and cynical, with a highly developed sense of the absurd. There was absolutely nothing a human being could do, no matter how depraved, that would surprise him. A shock of thick gray hair surmounted a wry, fine-looking, leathery face, with a pair of canny brown eyes lurking behind gold-rimmed spectacles. He went about in a trench coat and a Bogart fedora, like a character out of Raymond Chandler, and he was a great fan of American blues, film noir, and Philip Marlowe. The waitress brought in a tray with 2 black espressos and 2 glasses of mineral water. Spezi exhaled a stream of smoke, held a cigarette to one side, downed the espresso with one sharp movement, ordered another, and placed the cigarette back on his lip. We began chatting, Spezi speaking slowly for the benefit of my execrable Italian. I described to him the plot of my book. One of the main characters was to be a carabinieri officer, and I asked him to tell me just how the carabinieri operated. Spezi described the structure of the carabinieri, how they differed from the police, and how they conducted investigations while I took notes. He promised to introduce me to a colonel in the carabinieri who was an old friend. Finally, we fell to chatting about Italy, and he asked me where I lived. A tiny town called Giogoli. Spezi's eyebrows shot up. Giogoli? I know it well. Where? I gave him the address. Giogoli, a lovely historic town. It has 3 famous landmarks. Perhaps you already know of them. I did not. With a faint smile of amusement, he began. The first was Villa Sfacciata, where one of his very own ancestors, Amerigo Vespucci, had lived. Vespucci was the Florentine navigator, mapmaker, and explorer who was the first to realize that his friend Christopher Columbus had discovered a brand new continent, not some unknown shore of India, and who lent his name, Amerigo, Americus in Latin, to this new world. The second landmark, Spezi went on, was another villa called I Colazzi, with a facade said to be designed by Michelangelo, where Prince Charles stayed with Diana and where the prince painted many of his famous watercolors of the Tuscan landscape. And the third landmark? Spezi's smile widened. The most interesting of all. It's just outside your door. There's nothing outside our door but an olive grove. Precisely. And in that grove, one of the most horrific murders in Italian history took place. A double homicide committed by our very own Jack the Ripper. As a writer of murder mysteries, I was more intrigued than dismayed. I named him, Spezi said. I christened him Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. I covered the case from the beginning. At La Nazione, the other reporters called me the paper's monstrologer. He laughed, a sudden irreverent cackle hissing smoke out from between his teeth. Tell me about this Monster of Florence. You've never heard of him? Never. Isn't the story famous in America? It's completely unknown. That surprises me. It seems an almost American story. And your own FBI was involved, that group Thomas Harris made so famous, the Behavioral Science Unit. I saw Thomas Harris at one of the trials, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. They say he based Hannibal Lecter on the Monster of Florence. Now I was really interested. Tell me the story. Spezi downed his second espresso, lit another Gaulois, and began to talk through the smoke. As his story gathered steam, he slipped a notebook and a well-worn gold pencil from his pocket and began to diagram the narrative. The pencil cut and darted across the paper, making arrows and circles and boxes and dotted lines, illustrating the intricate connections among the suspects, the killings, the arrests, the trials, and the many failed lines of investigation. It was a long story, and he spoke quietly, the blank page of his notebook gradually filling. I listened, amazed at first, then astonished. As a crime novelist, I fancied myself a connoisseur of dark stories. I had certainly heard a lot of them, but as the story of the Monster of Florence unfolded, I realized it was something special, a story in a category all its own. I do not exaggerate when I say the case of the Monster of Florence may be, just may be, the most extraordinary story of crime and investigation the world has ever heard. Between 1974 and 1985, 7 couples, 14 people in all, were murdered while making love in parked cars in the beautiful hills surrounding Florence. The case had become the longest and most expensive criminal investigation in Italian history. Close to 100,000 men were investigated and more than a dozen arrested, many of whom had to be released when the monster struck again. Scores of lives were ruined by rumor and false accusations.